Still can't do an intro. Still don't really know how to do an intro. But happy Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, whenever you're listening. Good morning, good evening, good midday, whatever it may be. Welcome back to Chaotic Crime. And welcome back to our serial killer segment. So if you tuned in last week, you heard us talk about the Moors murders. I love how I always say us when it's me. Just me. Hello. I have a full team behind me of fucking no one. Come on, Tal. We're not doing that. All right, I've icked myself out already. So, yeah, back to what we were really talking about. If you tuned in last episode, you guys would have heard us discuss the Moors murders. It's always like, what are you supposed to say in this in between? What? In this in between when I'm getting into the case, and because I always feel so bad for just diving straight into it. But I think that's what we're gonna have to do today. So for this episode's location, I'm actually covering another Australian case. And I know quite a few people haven't heard of this one, which surprised me because even before I'd researched it, I had heard of it. I hadn't dove into it too much, if that makes sense, though. So this was an interesting one for me to do a little bit of a deep dive in, and always interesting to share. So for today, we're going to be traveling all the way to South Australia, and we're going to be discussing the Snowtown murders, also known as the bodies in the barrels. So between 1992 and 1999, 11 people were murdered in South Australia. So what really separates this case from other cases is that the bodies weren't found scattered in bushland or within homes or just left in random spots. The bodies were found in barrels full of acid, and these barrels were actually stored within an abandoned bank in a small town called Snowtown. Now, this case doesn't actually reflect on one person or one killer either. It was a group of individuals, but it was led by one person, John Bunting. So alongside John, there was Robert, James, and Mark, who we are going to get into their history and who the fuck they actually are. So don't worry, I know I'm just dropping names right now, but I just want to kind of give you guys a bit of a laydown of what we're going to get into today. So let's get into it. This is the story of the Snowtown murders. So like I said in the beginning, this was not just one sick, twisted individual. This was 4 people in total. Now, they were bound together by loyalty, by fear, and by cruelty, and by the same mission. But of course, like we've sort of discussed in lots of these cases, there's always one core, particularly sick, twisted individual that stands in the middle, generally. Like, I appreciate in some cases, in the minority of cases that, there's some where it's a bit different. But if we're generally speaking statistically, there's generally like one person that's brainwashed the group. So at the center of this case was John Bunting, James Vlassakis, Robert Wagner, and Mark Haydon. Now, the leader in this particular pack was John Bunting. So John's full name was John Justin Bunting, and he was born in 1966 in Inala, Queensland, but he grew up mostly within Adelaide. His early life was rough. He spoke later about being bullied and humiliated, and he claimed that he grew up in severe childhood abuse. Now, it's unclear whether every detail of this was true or not, but these stories did become a part of the mythology he built around himself. So by his mid-20s, Bunting reinvented himself as a man on a mission. Outwardly, he was friendly. Neighbours have gone on to recall him as someone chatty and helpful. He had a knack for making people trust him. But underneath all of that, John was really obsessed with the idea of cleansing society. And he went on to develop a pretty consuming hatred of people who were labelled as pedophiles or perverts. And he went as far as keeping files on his neighbourhood who he believed were gay or suspected of abuse. And this entailed scribbling names, all sorts of things, and this would later on to become his hit list. Now, the truth was most people he targeted weren't even pedophiles at all. Many were vulnerable, living with disabilities, mental illnesses, or addiction. And some were just simply people that he disliked or found inconvenient. He turned his hatred into justification, and later that justification would become murder. Now, what made John so dangerous was not the violence, it was the manipulation he had. He would cast himself as a protector, the man who would rid the world of evil, when in reality, he was the one creating it. Now, where Bunting was the leader, Robert Wagner was really his shadow. Born in 1971 in Adelaide, Robert's childhood was extremely unstable. His father was absent, and his home life was really chaotic. So by his teens, he had slipped to the margins completely and was just so desperate to belong. And in this, he found Bunting. So by the 1990s, Robert was John's right-hand man. While John supplied the twisted ideology, Robert was the one who appeared to carry out all the violence with all the chilling loyalty towards John. People went on to describe Robert as so loyal and dedicated to the point of blindness. And I think that's a great way of describing it. Now, James Vlassakis was born in 1979, and he was the youngest within the group. His life was again unstable like the others: neglect, abuse, and constant moves. He lived with his mother and her partner in a home that never quite felt secure to him. So by the mid-90s, he was a vulnerable teenager, desperate for approval. So again, a lot like Robert's story, he met Bunting. So at first, James, in all of his desperate need for approval, saw John as a father figure. Strong, decisive, someone who seemed to stand up for people. But over time, that mentorship turned into straight violence. So slowly, he was brought into the cruelty, escalating from dark talk to actual violence, until James himself participated in the murders. So at first, he was present, and then he was complicit, and then he eventually became an active killer. So unlike John and Robert, he wasn't born cold-blooded from the beginning. He was fragile and so deeply manipulated. And just to fast forward a little bit, it actually went on that James would be the one that confessed and testified against the others. And we will get into all of that later down the line. But his testimony was the whole reason why all of this came to light, in terms of why we know what we know now. So I think that just for a moment gives us a little bit of reflection on how much more, I guess, how much more, how do I word it? How much more conscience, that's what I was saying, the word I was trying to think, how much more conscience he has in comparison to the others. So in a lot of ways, I do believe that James was both the victim and the predator, groomed, broken down, and then remade into John's image. So Mark Haydon was the last of the group, and he was the accomplice of sorts. So Mark Haydon, I'm going to make sure that because it's like a don at the end instead of like a Haydon, it's a Haydon. I just want to make sure I'm working on my terminology, because I know that some people struggle. And then one thing to note, sorry, I'm deflecting for a second, but one thing to note, when I'm editing the visuals on this, I don't fuck around with the captions too much. So sometimes the captions do me so dirty, and if the word's coming out that way, it's coming out that way. We're just going to rock it and roll with it. I might try to get better with that, but potentially not. But anyway, back to the app. Mark Haydon was born in 1958, and he was actually the oldest within the group. So unlike James, who was the youngest, Mark was the oldest. Now, it's important to note that Mark wasn't actually directly involved in the killings, but he was a critical part in covering them up. He helped dispose of the bodies, store the barrels, and he kept the secrets. So Mark was actually a married man, and he was married to a woman named Elizabeth Haydon. Sorry. And unfortunately, Elizabeth later went on to become one of the victims. Now, Mark didn't have John's charismatic sort of energy, I guess you could say, or his personality, because people really liked John. That was one thing, was he just had a way of getting people to trust him. And then he didn't have Robert's loyalty. So one thing about Robert Wagner that sort of breaks him apart from everyone else in the group was his loyalty. He was the most loyal in the group. And then I want to say that he didn't have James's vulnerability either. But one thing that he did have was he had done enough to tie himself to these crimes. So he was a coward. Unfortunately, he knew that he could either walk away or call the police. So instead of doing either of those two options, he stayed. So together, these four formed what the police would later call a murderous enterprise. So in the early 1990s, John went on to move to Salisbury. I'm pretty sure it's Salisbury. Why doesn't that sound right? I actually went here quite a lot as a kid. This is where my yaya lived. If you guys didn't know, I'm half Greek, so I'm quite familiar with Adelaide, the good old Greek community around there. But I don't think I feel like I spent more time. I feel like I didn't spend much time in the north side. But the north side was considered in the 1990s as a working class suburb in the north of Adelaide. So on the surface, John really blended in, but behind closed doors, he was building what he would call a spider web. So he tracked all the people down that he despised in those notebooks that he was writing back earlier in the story. And he was spreading names and slurs all over the walls within his home. So I guess the way John sort of played this in his mind was once your name was on that web, on the wall that he drew, you were marked and there was no getting out of that. So at the same time, he was gathering all of his people around him. So we know those people to be Robert, Mark, and James. In the kitchens and the lounge rooms, they completely normalised the cruelty. They'd drink and make lists of people that they hated. They'd talk about getting rid of the filth, laugh about the violence. So for them, the murder was sort of just starting as a conversation, until it all started to become a lot more real. So the first victim was Clinton Greg Trezise. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Now, Clinton was only 22 years old. He was described as shy, quiet, and a little bit vulnerable. At the time, he had no steady job, but he was kind-hearted. He had no idea that crossing paths with John Bunting would cost him his life. So in August of 1992, at Lower Light in South Australia, Clinton was spotted spending time with Bunting's circle. So like I said, within that circle were the 4 accomplices. I'm actually not sure if Haydon was a part of this equation, so it was either 4 or 3. That wasn't specified when I researched, so in case anybody knows, please feel free to drop below. Now, I really want to put emphasis on no research, and absolutely no research has shown that Clinton was ever known by anybody to be dangerous or perverted or any means of those words whatsoever. But unfortunately, in Bunting's warped worldview, anybody who didn't fit his perception of normal was labelled as a pervert or weak or weird, and that label alone was enough to fit murder. So one night in particular, Clinton was invited to spend time with the group. And I think maybe at this time Clinton did believe that they were friends. Inside the house, the tone shifted. Bunting and Robert attacked and Clinton was beaten savagely, and that beating led to him being killed. His body was then later buried in a shallow grave on a farmland. He was simply just labelled as missing for years. No headlines and no closure for the family. Now for John Bunting, this killing was literally his first test. It was proof that he could decide who lived and who died. And it wouldn't be the last time that he decided to do that. So after this, Bunting's fantasy of cleansing society turned into his blueprint for murder. So 3 years later, the next known victim was Ray Davies. Now, Ray was 26 years old and lived in Salisbury North. Ray was known to have an intellectual disability. He wasn't powerful and he wasn't predatory at all. He was just a man that was simply struggling to get by. Now, by 1995, Bunting's influence had spread into the home of Elizabeth Harvey, the mother of James. Now, at this time, Elizabeth had started a relationship with Ray, who had moved into the family home. Now, this ultimately ended up putting him right under Bunting's nose. So during this time, Bunting then began to label Ray as a pervert and as weak, but there was no proof to back up any of his claims. But unfortunately, once Bunting had actually said this, the group just treated it as though it was fact. So as a result of this, one night Ray was lured into the backyard of the Harvey home in which he was living at the time, because Ray and Elizabeth were together. So Elizabeth is the mother of James, who is part of the 4. Just want to, because sometimes it gets confusing when you're listening and you're like, whoa, wait, so many names. So I just thought I'd bring that back. Now, outside in the backyard, there was Robert, and young James was actually there as well. Now, under John's command, Bunting's command, they strangled Ray. Now, his body was left in a pit in the backyard and then later moved and buried somewhere else. So again, to the outside world, Ray had just disappeared. But inside the group, his death became another secret binding them all together, and another step further into the horror. So now we're fast forwarding to 1996, and Bunting has killed 2 people at this point, and it appeared as though his demeanour was showing that he was a murderer. Now the next victim went on to be Suzanne Allen, who was 47 years old. Now she lived near Bunting in Salisbury North as well. She was lonely and struggled severely with her mental health, making her yet another easy target. She likely died during an assault that involved John and Robert. What is known is that her body was left decomposing inside her own home for some time before the authorities were alerted because of the smell. And by the time police had found her, decomposition made it extremely difficult to prove exactly what had happened and how she had died. Now, it's important to note that John Bunting was actually charged with her murder, but that charge didn't stick at the time. Even so, Susan is widely considered to be part of the Snowtown story, another vulnerable person who crossed paths with the group and ultimately didn't survive. Now, Susan's case really does show, I think, to us how casual this is all becoming to them. The violence is just a normality. So Clinton was buried at this point, Ray was hidden, and then Susan was just left rotting inside her home. Now, not only are we moving to a more casual field, it's becoming a little bit more sloppy. I don't know if that's just me, maybe I listen to too much crime, but we're getting sloppy. So sloppiness generally comes with cockiness, right? Murderers are always fucking cocky. There's one thing we can always say, always. But if there's one thing that we can all agree on is that the killing has become normal for the group. They've stepped out of this is not normal to, yeah, no worries, let's do it. It's like another day. If you're watching the visuals, you can see me going, just like throwing my hands up in the air, like, what the fuck am I actually? Because no matter how many cases I cover, how many times I read these stories, they still blow my fucking mind every time. Even though I have researched this and read this a million, it still blows my mind. So the fourth and fifth victim came in 1997. Michael Gardiner, 19, was an openly gay, bright and flamboyant man. That alone made him a target in John's eyes. And at the time, Michael Gardiner was friends with a man called Barry Lane, who was 42. Now, Barry was another man who was unfortunately on John Bunting's radar. Now, Michael was strangled and his body disappeared. His family were left with questions and absolutely no answers. So ultimately, Michael was just killed for being who he was. There was nothing else around it. But Barry was a bit different. So Barry Lane had a past with Robert. Barry had been Robert's older partner when Robert was younger, and they had ultimately sort of lived together. By 1997, he had started to speak about John's behaviour, and this made him a liability. So under Bunting's influence, Robert turned on him. Barry was strangled and his body was later dismembered. So Barry's death was more about hatred, but also a lot about control. Loyalty to Bunting trumped over any form of bond that Robert ever had. So these murders ultimately marked a bit of a shift within the group. The victims were definitely more connected and more visible within Adelaide. Their disappearances certainly started to raise eyebrows, but without bodies or clear evidence, police couldn't join the dots just yet. So before the killings ultimately turned inwards to family, there was Thomas Trevillan, who was 18 years old. Now, Thomas struggled severely with his mental health and had spent some time with the group, sometimes even staying with them. His instability quickly made him a risk. He talked too much and reacted unpredictably. And in Bunting's paranoid mind, that meant he had to go. So in November 1997, Thomas was found hanging from a tree in Adelaide Hills. Now, at the time, it did look like a suicide. However, we now know that the scene had been staged that way on purpose. So the later testimony from James revealed that John and Robert had actually strangled Thomas and then hung him to make it look self-inflicted at the time. Another murder, but this time it was ultimately to cover their tracks. So it seems that, like, if you're coming into this group and you in any way just don't fit this man's mold of normal, you're gone. You're out. I can just say I'd be fucked because I'm so mentally, like, not, there. God, I'd be a target. I would be a target. I start to get stuttery at this time because I know, like, it's the level of cruelty never ever shocks me, ever. Never ever ever. Like, these are all just people that are struggling one way or another, and most of us within humankind are struggling. I think the biggest, like, elephant in the room that we need to actually talk about is, John, are you struggling? Because fucking obviously you're sick and twisted in your head. Anyway, if you're watching the visuals, you know how much I scratch my head and just, like, I can't sit still. ever. Like, this is not a sitting still podcast for me at all. So now we're going to talk about one of the darkest betrayals in all of this, and that is Elizabeth Haydon. So Elizabeth was 37 years old, and she was married to Mark Haydon, who was one of the group's accomplices. She was described as kind and warm and the sort of person who really held her family together. Now, by the late 1998, she had begun to suspect something was seriously wrong. The disappearances, the secrets that her husband was keeping. But unfortunately, as we now know, that in this paranoid little circle, suspicion was truly enough for you to be signing your death warrant. Now, in November of 1998, John and Robert had murdered Elizabeth in her own house. Now, Mark Haydon had done nothing to stop it. Her body was placed in one of those plastic barrels that would later become found within Snowtown. When she went missing, her family were immediately alarmed. Mark told the police stories that she had left, that she had walked out, all of which we now know are lies, because he knew exactly where she was. Now, I really want to put emphasis on the fact that Mark was in the house. He watched the whole thing. He didn't stop it. He done nothing. He literally done nothing. Her husband helped cover up his own wife's murder. I truly don't think it gets much colder than that. So the last known victim was David Johnson, who was 24 years old, and he was the half-brother of James. So by May of 1999, James has completely, I really just want to put emphasis on this, he has completely crossed the line from being a manipulated teenager to a full-blown participant. Like, he was a full-blown active murderer at this point. So Bunting had ordered James to lure David to Snowtown. James went on to tell David that there was a cheap computer for sale in an old bank building within the town. And David walked into the vault expecting a quick deal. Now, inside that vault was John and Robert. Once the heavy vault door closed, David was overpowered, tortured, and murdered. And then his body went on to be stuffed into the barrel. One more victim reduced to bones and acid. Now, David's killing would be the one that would finally unravel everything. So by 1999, a different kind of suspicion appeared to be building. Now, this wasn't just about missing people, but more about money. Families noticed welfare payments were still being collected, even though their loved ones were missing. Centrelink records showed benefits being withdrawn long after people were last seen, so the investigators ultimately followed that paper trail. So once the police started to follow that paper trail, it led them to north of Adelaide, to a tiny farming town known as Snowtown. So the population within Snowtown was about 500 people. Now, this is the kind of place that nothing much happens, no crime happens, everyone knows everyone. Now, on the main street of Snowtown stood a disused and discarded bank building. Empty rooms, dusty windows, and a faded sign, but still within that bank was a vault. So on the 20th of May 1999, detectives forced open that vault. Now, as the seal broke, a wave of stench rolled out, so foul that the officers actually doubled over, gagging. The smell of human composition could not be missed. If you're a detective, I'm sure, as I've sort of listened to many interviews, apparently it's just a scent that you can't mistake it with any other. So inside that vault were 6 large blue plastic barrels, and the lids were basically bolted down. So when the police did eventually pry open those barrels, they found human remains in hydrochloric acid. So it was limbs, torsos, and just many, many dismembered body parts. Now, some of these barrels actually did hold more than one person, so bodies were literally tangled, skin was slipping, and clothes were still half clinging to what was left on these bodies. So a lot of forensic experts came onto the scene and said it was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. Even seasoned officers really did struggle to stay within that room. So in total, 8 victims were found in those barrels. Later searches found 3 more bodies on other sites, bringing the total to 11. Now, these barrels weren't just disposal. They were evidence of how confident these men had become, that they could stash bodies in a vault in the middle of a small town and just walk away. Now, from that day on, Snowtown went on to never be Snowtown again. So inside that vault, they didn't just find barrels. They found blood-stained clothing, ropes, cords, knives, syringes, lots of tools of torture. They also found John's notes and lists, names, insults, targets, financial records showing the victim's benefits being drained. So the picture was truly clear at this point. This wasn't chaotic or random violence. It was organised and it was systematic. So when the news broke across Australia, I mean, it's pretty easy to say that everyone reeled. The words "bodies in the barrel" were everywhere. Reporters completely flooded Snowtown. Locals were totally stunned, ashamed, angry. Their quiet town had suddenly become a global byword for horror, and it was completely under the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Now, what truly ended up disturbing people the most was that this wasn't some sort of lone mobster. This wasn't like a Ted Bundy or a Jeffrey Dahmer. This was a group of individuals. It was a neighbour, a husband, and a teenager. People that are truly ordinary on the surface, but monstrous together. So by 2003, the Snowtown trial had begun. Now, all of this took place within the Supreme Court of South Australia. Now, it became one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in Australian history. So throughout the trial, you had the accused, which was John, and throughout the trial, he did appear calm, controlled, and sometimes even smirking, scribbling notes like he thought he was the smartest person in the room. And then you had Robert, who was heavier, quieter, and quite openly defendant. At one point, he even admitted to actually enjoying the killings. And then you had James, who was younger, slight, and carrying a lot more guilt. He had already turned witness for the Crown. So then you had Mark Haydon, who sort of just sat there quite awkward, sweating. And I think he was struggling to, I guess, grasp like how he stood in any of this. In all of my research, he sort of just kept going, well, I didn't do it. And it's like, yeah, but you lied for years and you were an accomplice in helping dispose of the bodies. Sometimes being a bystander is one of the worst things of all. Now, the Crown's case was relentless. They had forensic evidence from the barrels and from the graves. They had the tools and the lists found within the vault, all the financial records proving all of the fraud, and testimony from the officers, neighbours, and relatives. And then the most devastating evidence came from James. So James took the stand, and as far as I'm actually getting from all of my evidence, he was on the stand for weeks. And he spent weeks describing all of these murders in detail. So as we know, Clinton was the first, and he was beaten and killed. And then Ray was strangled in the backyard while the household just carried on nearby. Then his half-brother David was lured to Snowtown and murdered within the vault. Now, he admitted to participating in 4 killings in total. He described the torture, the banking details forced from the victims, and the smell of the barrels. Now, throughout his testimony, he did speak quite flat. It was described in so many articles that he spoke so flat, which for some people made it so much worse. It was almost like the violence had become so normal to him that he was so monotoned when talking about it. And it, I guess, in a way made him appear even less remorseful. Because as we can imagine, right, he's telling these stories and like we've got these families of these victims sitting there sobbing. And you're just like flatly. So I think that just didn't, it just didn't settle well with people because in all the research, I have read that a lot. So unfortunately, even if James did show more remorse than the others, it still wasn't enough. Now, the defense really did try to attack James's credibility and minimize each man's role, but the evidence was ultimately overwhelming. So in 2003, the jury went on to find John guilty of 11 murders, Robert guilty of 10 murders, James guilty of 4 murders, and Mark guilty of assisting in multiple murders and disposing of bodies. Now, the sentences were a little bit different for all. So John and Robert served life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, meaning they are never coming home in this lifetime. Ray, thank fuck for that. A fucking happy ending. Now, James was required to serve life with a minimum of 26 years, meaning he has the possibility of getting out in 26 years. Mark Haydon went on to serve 25 years in total. Now, I believe all of these men are still in jail now. Now, for the law, justice was served, but for the families, it was only the beginning of a lifetime of grief. So one big thing is, where are the Snowtown killers today? Are they still alive? Are they still around? Are they still in jail? please. So John Bunting is actually in his late 50s and he is still serving his 11 life sentences in Yatala Labour Prison with absolutely no possibility of parole. The reporters say that over the years he still shows no remorse. He's still framing himself as some kind of crusader. Now, Robert Wagner is another one, and he is also serving life without parole. He's gone on to be described as a routine compliant prisoner, but he's openly admitted that he does enjoy killing. He has no apologies and no regrets for his actions. Now, James is actually now in his mid-40s. He is still serving his minimum of 26 years for the 4 murders in which he took part in. So technically, James is actually up for parole. However, all of the families of the victims have come forward and said that they never want him to be released. Now, Mark Haydon got 25 years and he is currently eligible for parole, but he is still incarcerated. So I'm unsure why, whether the parole board's just taking some time, whether obviously there's a reason why he hasn't been released. But his potential release has been extremely controversial. The families argue that even if he didn't kill with his own hands, his silence and lies are ultimately what made this go on longer. So at this current stage, all of the killers, as far as I know, have been locked away. If I've gotten that wrong, I will put that below. In the, are you right, Tal? Can you think in the episode description? So that I can update you guys on that one. But I will also put, like I do, some of the links and stuff to where I got this information and some further deep dives below. So ultimately, I think when we talk about the Snowtown murders, it's pretty easy to focus on the barrels because it's like the wow factor of the case. Like, do I want to say wow factor? But there's, I guess, generally certain things in certain cases that pull them apart, right? And the barrels in this one is that, and it's easy for us to just focus on that. But we really do need to remember the people. 11 lives were taken in this case, and that's 11 individuals that are never going to get the chance to live the future that they deserve. Their families are still suffering with loss now. So I just want us to reflect for a second, because when we remember Snowtown, let's not just remember the barrels or the vault or the horrificness of all of it. Let's try to remember the lives that were stolen and the families that were broken and those victims as individuals themselves, not just as victims in the Snowtown murders. Now, I will say this, if you have heard of this case and you are from Australia, you will know how much this case fucked with Australia. Just as a whole, because it was the gruesomeness and the brutality within this case was pretty insane for Australia. I think within our time we hadn't quite seen anything like it, hence why it is still known to be one of Australia's most expensive trials in history. So I would love to know what you guys thought about this one. What do you guys think about the Aussie crime? Does it rattle you as much as it rattles me? Tell me your thoughts. I'd also love to know if anyone has heard of this case, or if anyone has any further info on it. If you guys want to deep dive in, my God, stutter. If you guys want me to further deep dive into some of those victim stories a little bit more, please let me know. I can definitely do that, but I just kind of tried to keep it as compact as I could so that I could get everyone's stories in there, because we had 11 people to talk about today. And then, of course, our evil fuckers, we had to talk about those too, unfortunately. So this was the Snowtown murders, or the bodies in the barrels. It's a reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't always under the bed. Sometimes they're simply just smiling at you as you cross the street. So thank you for joining me for another episode of Chaotic Crime, and I will see you guys next time. But until then, please stay loud, stay curious, and stay cautious.